Karolina Wilczyńska, who is probably the most talented student I have ever had, and this is my great pleasure to include her in the activities of the center. She has been such a support. She has prepared both this conference and our stay in Sarajevo, so I'm very thankful, and it was a great paper. Karolina, thank you so much. I'm going now to open mine. Okay. So my text is more of a theoretical one, and basically I have been trying to elaborate for some time now alternative method of analysis that would challenge formal analysis tradition and also enable me to implement Marxist way of thinking into analysis. So let me start. When we started our resonances project, I had no idea that I would be asked to bring the NET's archive into the meritorical care of Piotrowski Center. Even then, I wanted to return to my research into the art of the 70s for several reasons. Firstly, it seemed to me that in light of the thesis of my book on the decade of 70s in Hungarian art and the Marxist background of the Hungarian artists, a comparative study of art in East Central Europe and the Global South would be interesting for me. Secondly, when I was asked by the head of the Igor Zabel Association for Culture and Theory, Urszka Jurman, to write an afterword to the English language edition of the last book of Piotrowski, I realized that in essence, his research opens up a new perspective. It is not only about advanced comparatistics of two regions, but above all about working on what Piotrowski insists on in his book, that is breaking with the tradition of formal analysis and developing the foundations of what he calls material analysis. While working with Piotrowski's book, his thesis on pop art, socialist realism, or the net of Kozłowski, I realized how much I would have liked it in an old-fashioned way to talk to him about it. However, all I could do is to write down my doubts, which were also based on the differences that we had constituted our conversations for many years. By and large, the matter concerned what Piotrowski, following Kitty Zeemans, called material analysis, demanding from the global studies to reject the dominance of West-centric formal analysis in favor of more on material one. Reading his texts, especially those on socialist realism, I noticed that, despite his deep hesitation toward formal analysis, Piotrowski insists in the chapter on strictly formal or even stylistic definition of the movement, thereby denying its global impact. Admitting overtly he does not equate official Soviet art with socialist realism, Piotrowski immerses rather into the formal characteristic of communist art than its social role and class function. Piotrowski's analysis and diagnosis stumbled over something that was difficult to grasp for me, for it was not a strictly formal analysis attachment. He paid far too much attention to the political context to fall into such a simple trap. Rather, the core of the problem was his disregard of class issues and underestimation of the analysis of the relations of production. For my own use, I considered Piotrowski to be stumbling over what I named superstructural analysis without giving primordial attention to the base. In his superstructural attachment, Piotrowski assumes that Cold War can be reduced to a tension between modernism and socialist realism, consistently denying the latter the status of modernism. He believes that modernism was realized in Central Eastern Europe in the form of a yearning for autonomy of art, while in South American modernism, with its program of autonomy, was associated with withdrawal from the artist from the public life. In his last book, Piotrowski globalizes horizontal art history, proposing yet anew in the form of a project of altered globalist art history. Its core lies in its attempt to determine the relationship between global art history and post-colonial studies and the impact of the latter on the issue of East European artistic peripheries. Piotrowski rejects post-colonial criticism of Eurocentrism, opposing the notion identifying Europe with the historical experience, I quote, of European colonization that he finds simplistic. He also maintains that, I quote, the path to globalism or global art history of Eastern Europe leads through Europe, not against it, end of quote. It seems that Piotrowski's incoherent approach toward Marxism influences his argument to the extent he ignores Marxist criticism of post-colonial narrative, such as the book Eurocentrism by Egyptian Marxist Samir Amin, published in English in 1989. That not only provides adequate answer to certain issues raised by Piotrowski, peculiar situation of East Central Europe, Greece or Scandinavia. Moreover, it approaches them from a number of different angles. While Piotrowski never formulates clear definition of the periphery, although it was always crucial for his theoretical approach, perceiving it rather as a function, a construct of a narrative in power, Amin overtly links it to the, I quote, inequality in the distribution of income, end of quote. Thus, Piotrowski's criticism of post-colonial narrative is trapped within what is viewed in Marxist criticism of post-colonialism as its own false premise. In the text, Marxism and post-colonial theory, Sagar Sanyal describes the premise as primacy of culture, a quote, contrary to Marxist approach that treats material processes, including social relations, as primary, and then explains the movement of ideas and culture on that basis, end of quote. Marxist perspective enables to perceive both notions of a center and peripheries, crucial for Piotrowski also in his last book. The last book opens up with a call for global peripheries to unite, as a mere reflection of class division. Center can be thus defined as a result of the solidified accumulation of capital, periphery of exploitation. Although Piotrowski involved in the cultural, or in Marxist terms, superstructural perspective reflects rather upon the exclusion than exploitation, he also emphasizes in his previous texts the privileged status of periphery, that is, its critical position. Hence, I believe that when framed with Marxism, Piotrowski's notion of periphery is not distant from Marxist understanding of proletariat in the aspect of its self-awareness. However, Piotrowski also falls into the traps aptly diagnosed by Mignolo in the text Reconstituting the Destituted, How the Colonial and the Western Interweaving Works. Mignolo explicitly articulates his distrust of the notion of so-called cultural difference, claiming that, I quote, it hides the power differential that in decolonial conceptualization we disclose and uncover as colonial and imperial differentials. Western epistemology, he argues, and the particular dimensions called aesthetics or philosophy of fine arts cannot escape colonial and imperial differences in the modern colonial world order and imaginary, end of quote. According to Mignolo, I quote, modern colonial world order cannot be what it is without the making and management of colonial and imperial differences. End of quote. To him, I quote, the first operates mainly by inventing racial and sexual power differentials, and the latter are differences fabricated to sustain the order of the world, so to speak, as he concludes. Mignolo thus perceives such differences as strategies of the West. I was thinking along similar lines when I wrote for our book on horizontal art history, the text entitled Not Horizontal Enough, dedicated to Piotrowski's horizontal art history, arguing that as long as horizontal art history does not take into account the notion of class as essential, it is not horizontal enough. In my text, Materializing Net, delivered in Prague last November, I pointed out specific aspects of Piotrowski's analysis in relation to the exhibition of Brazilian artist Angelo Giacchino at Accumulatory 2 Gallery. Now I need to show you the work, which is also exposed in the exhibition, by the way. I criticized the discursive binary opposition which Piotrowski insisted on between Giacchino and Kozłowski, artist and curator, constructed in Piotrowski's text. Without, something happened? Without putting this in the context of Marxist relations of production. I claim this binary and the false paradoxes it entailed could easily be abrogated by moving beyond the paradigm of individualism towards collective work. I believe my role within the net archives is to do research aimed at re-evaluating dominant narratives to materialize the net, or in other words, to tear the net out of the superstructural attachment present in the dominating narratives on net that Luisa Kępińska is going to speak about. What then would be the principle of what, in opposition to superstructural analysis, might be referred to as basal analysis, apart from the fact that it should take into the account class analysis as fundamental? To answer this question, it is first necessary to consider what kind of meaning might emerge as a result of such an analysis. Contrary to the superstructural analysis that enables the accumulation of cultural capital conditioned by the production of the surplus value that involves unpaid labor, the basal analysis introduces a tool that resists those mechanisms. Above all, it seems important to take into the account what Marx, in a text with the symptomatic title, The Poverty of Philosophy, referred to as the law of value. This theorem, elaborated by Marx, sets as a necessary relationship between value and socially necessary labor. After the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, in 2063, Ernesto Che Guevara and Alberto Mora published polemical articles in the Cuban magazine Nueva Industria, Revisita Económica, in order to revise the relevance of the Cuban Revolution in the perspective of Marxist theory of value. Che Guevara denied the possibility of consciously using the law of value, that was a quote from Che Guevara, refusing to see the labor as commodity, both in socialist mode of production and the transition period that was facing as he was facing as Cuban head of the Department of Industrialization and president of the National Bank of Cuba. Guevara saw the implementation of what became to be recognized as labor theory value as being based on false premises, namely the equation of the worker with commodity brought throughout his permanent obligation to sell owns labor power. He instead proposed the category of social duty perceived by him as adequate for both communist production and transition from capitalism. Guevara resisted what is elaborated as labor theory of value, claiming it relies on the invasion of labor, power, and commodity. Those issues are of the crucial importance because of the Che Guevara critique of Soviet manual of political economy, which he diagnosed as a return to capitalism, which turned out to be true. The situation of art history in the face of its desire to abandon its superstructural attachment resembles the nationalization of Cuban industry, appropriated to the large extent by the United Fruit Company, which exploited both workers and the natural environment in Latin and South America. It seems to be facing a constitutive step backwards, which is in fact a polemical movement against the hegemonic linear history of progress identified with the expansion of the market. But what does this movement towards the base means in practice. In a strictly Marxist sense, that would mean taking into account mode of production. That is, the specific organization of economic production in a given society. In a comparative analysis of art from different areas of the world, the notion of crucial cultural, racial, or ethnic difference, which as much as strategy can simply become a product as well, would be replaced by a comparative analysis of the means of production. The traditionally used, within the tradition of formal analysis, of course, notion of a workshop must therefore be challenged. Indeed, the usual tools of the artist are being replaced by those that influence the distribution of surplus product and equal means of production. Those, according to Marx, should also include land, mineral, energy, and water deposits. The basal analysis would thus examine whether and to what extent art production of to what extent art reproduce or intervene in the existing patterns of ownership for means of production. A second important area of basal analysis would be the consideration of productive forces in a sense of labor power, followed by an analysis how it intertwined with means of production. Thus the narrative on exclusion dominating comparative or even alter globalist art history should be replaced by the narrative on exploitation. Its measure would equal to the distribution of the means of production. The artistic proletariat, according to Marx, is thus that the logics as a group that reproduces its labor power in a different ways under different economic conditions. Such a mechanism would constitute the bottom line of exploitation. However, it never takes into the a possession of the means of production, neither does it accumulate a surplus value, because it is Marx's definition of exploitation, that it is only, its bottom level is a need for proletariat to reproduce its labor power, and its upper line is it can earn as much, so to make it impossible for proletariat to possess means of production. The basal analysis would finally have to concern what Marx already referred to in Poverty of Philosophy as relations of production, namely the total of social, economic, or technological relationships one needs to enter. In his 1859 preface to a contribution to the critique of political economy, Marx discussed those issues, followed by his famous claim, I quote, "It is not the consciousness of man that determines the existence, but the social existence that determines the consciousness," end of quote, firmly establishing thus the primacy of the base over the superstructure. Formal analysis marginalized those issues at best. It depreciated them as trivial, anecdotal, and insignificant. This is the right reason why I ask in my interview with Kozłowski about the relationship between the material limitations of the net and censorship, the mode of production. It is apparent that the majority of contacts within the net were mediated and thus narrated in English, that constitutes the essential mean of production, both of contemporary art and art history. Christina Freire rightly noted, when analyzing the grammar of Kozłowski, the work, which is in the form of an art book that was sent by Kozłowski to Brazil as a part of an exchange, Christina also was referring to it, that English, in which the book was being written by Kozłowski, being the conjugation of the verb to be, meant a sort of a false identity for the artist. Freire optimistically believes, however, that although English could influence communication, it was not a source of identification. The internationalism expressed here, as she continues, was not ideological, but had an instrumental purpose. I'm much more skeptical here. Even in this room, no one pays attention to how much work and resources have been invested in ensuring that most speakers for whom English is not the natural language could express their thesis correctly enough to be taken seriously by their Western colleagues. This mechanism of universal communication requires a lot of work and resources from the non-native speaking world has become invisible. English is an essential means of knowledge production that most of artistic global community will never possess. This is where the division of labor, which is a problem for most of the periphery, comes from. This mechanism Kozłowski criticized, although not explicitly, in the interview when he spoke about cheap production of the Western publication devoted to cooperative approaches. According to such a mechanism of division of labor, the periphery produces source material, develops archives, while symbolical capital is accumulated by Western researchers who are in possession of means of knowledge production. I think that by describing this production as cheap, which was controversial and I understand, but Kozłowski subconsciously meant something else, something opposite. He meant that it was based on cheap labor. So the labor was cheap, not the production. Now that the Piotr Piotrowski Center is on the verge of making an order, the net archive, I believe that the key to this is to strengthen those structures that makes cooperation based on equality possible. So, so really to answer the call of Piotrowski for global peripheries to unite. Thank you so much, and I'm in time.